This Shabbat, we read from the Torah portion, Ve'et Hanan, from the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy. And as Rabbi Keller mentioned last week, it is really one long sermon delivered by Moses to the Israelites as they're about to enter the land. But the Shabbat is also Shabbat Nachamu, which is the Shabbat of comfort. We are amidst reading the Haftorah portions, which follow Tisha B'Av. Does anyone know when Tisha B'Av was? It was last Sunday. It's the recognition, the memorial of the destruction of the second temple, and many people say the first temple, and many people say there are a lot of other dates associated with the ninth day of Av. Tomorrow and Sunday is the next part, which is called Tu B'Av, which is really a day for love. It's sort of Jewish Valentine's Day, which comes up this Sunday. So what happens is we turn our spiritual clocks toward comfort, words of comfort, following the 3 weeks that led up to Tisha B'Av, which were the Haftorah, which we called the Haftorah of Rebuke, where the Israelites are told that their really bad behavior was going to lead them down a very bad path, which ultimately manifests itself in the destruction of the temples. And now we read tomorrow morning from Haftorah, Ve'et Hanan, or for this Torah, for this week, parsha that begins, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, be comforted, my people. And the bipolar spiritual nature that is that of us as Jews, going from one extreme, rebuke and destruction, to another extreme of comfort and reconciliation with our God in this Shabbat, that is, in a nutshell, one of the key, most fundamental essences of what it means to be a Jewish person. It's why we are so neurotic, because we go from one extreme to the next extreme. When we're feeling good and content, we're waiting for the other shoe to fall. And when the shoe falls, we sit there in the midst of our misery, in some sort of ways, misery that we're very used to, and then we look forward to better days ahead. Well, I'm going to do a little bit of both tonight, but mostly for rabbis, I am definitely going to do something disturbing, because I am going to mention that beginning this Shabbat, it is 7 weeks, because there are 7 Haftorah portions of comfort, 7 weeks until Rosh Hashanah, until the High Holy Days begin. So we are at the countdown officially. So that's the bad news for rabbis. But Rabbi Keller has told me that he has all of his sermons written already. And because Jason is now the intern, he will be writing my sermons that I will be delivering and taking all of the credit for. So in Ve'et Hanan, in this week's Parsha, which is also famous because it does have the Shema, the actual Shema, and the Ahavta as well. Every bat mitzvah girl becoming a bat mitzvah tomorrow or any other year is thrilled that they got the easy one, because they already know the V'ahavta, right? So you get to actually chant it from the Torah tomorrow. But in this week's Parsha, something interesting is said by Moses. He says to God, "You, Adonai, you, O God, have begun to show your servant, me, Moses, your greatness." It's very curious that he uses this phrase, that Moses says, "O God, you have begun to show me your greatness." Moses is realizing, is really coming to terms, he's 120 years old, he's about to die, and he's coming to terms with 2 things. Number 1, his impending death, and number 2, that he's not allowed, and he will not enter and cross over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, which will become Israel. And he knows that, and in a way, he's trying to still butter God up a little bit, and say, God, you're so, instead of just saying, God, you're so great, you're so wonderful, you're magnificent, he says, even now, O God, you have begun to show your servant, me, Moses, your greatness. And in this Parsha, we're wondering why Moses, at 120, uses that word begun, as if this is the first time he's ever talked to God or had a relational moment with God. Why does he do that? Well, one of the great Hasidic rabbis, the founder of Hasidut, the Baal Shem Tov, said that Moses used that verb, begun, to show your servant your greatness, because Moses was God's faithful servant, the greatest of the prophets, the recipient of the Torah from God. He says, after 120 years of the most godly life ever lived, the most intimate relationship with God of any human being. Even Moses, at 120, the Baal Shem Tov says, sees himself as only having begun a relationship with God. Moses knew God better than any person in the history of the world, and yet as he's about to die, realizes in a way, the Baal Shem Tov says, he's just starting his relationship. Covenantal love, that kind of deep, intimate, beautiful love that we all seek. And I think about this when I see couples who've been married 50, 60. We have couples in this congregation married 65, 67 years. That's the kind of love I'm talking about. Those are the couples who say, it's as if we fall in love anew every day. Right? That's love. Taka, that's love. Thank you, Lance. At the very end of our lives, though, there's a lesson here. And maybe, Bobby, this will come up on our radio show on Friday when we talk about whatever it is that we're going to talk about. At the very end of our lives, though, a new understanding of our relationship with God can be birthed, can actually begin. Both for the person dying and for those of us who are staying and finishing our lives. Prior to death, we know, is a time ripe with possibilities of acute sensitivity to our relationship with God, to turn to God for strength, insight, and comfort in ways we never have before. I would say at the end of people's lives, their faith adds days, weeks, even months to their lives. Even more, in Jewish wisdom, we learn that the afterlife might hold untold possibilities for our relationship with God. And we will be teaching again this year. I will be teaching, I'm going to do it in one class, Death, Dying, and the Afterlife, and talk about this concept. Judaism has a rich tradition regarding the afterlife. And in that tradition, we find innumerable connections with God. Moses teaches us, therefore, in this parsha, that at the end of our life, we have this acute sense, this hyper-vigilant sense, this hyper-faith that enables us to create a whole new relationship with God, because at the end of our lives, and I don't mean this to be flippant, we probably think to ourselves, what have I got to lose by opening my heart and my spirit to have a relationship with God? But the question is, on this Shabbat, as we have 7 weeks until we are supposed to enter into the process of cheshbon hanefesh, of checking in with ourselves and looking inward and balancing our personal spiritual bank account, if you will. What about our relationship with God during our lives, when we have our health, when we're very much alive, when we don't have to worry about, or we shouldn't worry about, I should say, our impending doom? Remember, it's Shabbat Nachamu, so these are the comforting words. Nothing brings Jews closer to our struggle with the belief in God more to the forefront than their consciences, than any kind of tragedy, for example. When we see the floods in Louisiana, when we see what's happening in our country, Rabbi Keller spoke about this a few weeks ago as well, with all of these shootings and police violence of civilians against police and police against civilians. When we see in the bigger picture in the world around us acts of evil, tragedy triggers connection with God for lots and lots of people. And you don't just have to be a Jew in order to see that. One of the things, if tragedy brings us closer, by the way, we have to, of course, ask the question, well, why wait for a tragedy? What about our relationship with God without tragedy, without despair, and without waiting until the end of our lives? We're going to read in 7 weeks those words that haunt us if we really focus on them in the Hebrew and in the English. Unatana tokef kedushat hayom kihu narav hayom. Let us declare the sacred power of this day. The awe of this day is full of dread. It's the only liturgy we recall on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's only said those 4 days. But as we enter into this process of the 7 weeks before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I want us to frame those words that we're going to say those 4 times on those 4 holidays within the context of this parsha. What can you do? What can we do to create a stronger sense of connection and connectedness to God? Given the following: start where you're at. Be like Moses. It has only just begun. Be open to the possibility that a relationship with God, and defining God, I know it's not an easy thing to do, but our relationship with our Creator, our relationship with the God who controls the universe, not the day-to-day interactions of the universe, but the universe itself, that energy that flows within us toward goodness and compassion and mercy and love, that energy that can enable us in our relationship with our loved ones, our spouses and our children, to look at them and see the face of God. That energy can start anew, right now, today. Start thinking about God now, not at the pre-Rosh Hashanah dinner table, not at the service while Unetana Tokef is being chanted for the first time, but now. And learn from Moses and Be'et Hanan that it can be new and fresh. Let go of your pediatric notions of the old man sitting up in heaven in a chair with the book of life. Create for yourself that energy, that spirit. Start fresh. I'm going to conclude with something that I told the campers at camp this summer during one of our Shabbat services. We have senses. We all know this. We have different senses. We see. We have the sense of seeing, of smelling, of touching, of tasting, and of hearing. And so I asked the campers, and I ask you tonight, keeping in mind these words, you, O God, have begun to show your servant your greatness as of today. It's time for us to develop a sixth sense, and that is a sense of God. Using our taste and our touch and our hearing and our speaking and our seeing, perhaps, you need to have a sense of God in order to, as Moses did at the end of his life, understand this entire universe and put it into context and give yourself a sense that you've got more than a fighting chance, more than the possibilities that you think are at your disposal, to really change yourself, your family, and to reframe the entire way that you see the world around you. That is what we learn from Moses. Develop a sense of God. Begin by coming to Torah study, by learning with us, learning with each other. Get a sense of what God is to you. And you will find in these next 7 weeks, I promise you, yourselves truly preparing yourselves for the High Holy Days. And that experience, if you do this, will be completely different than it's ever been before. Much more profound, much more centering, and much more thoughtful. You'll get something out of services. Not to say that you haven't in the past, but it'll be completely different. Develop a sense of God anew. Shabbat Shalom.